In this video lecture, we're going to take a look at how to use a while loop in the scanner class to read in unknown amounts of data from a text file. Okay, let's get started. Another common application of the while loop comes in reading data from a file. Think about it. If we have some text file, absent any advanced knowledge of that file, we can't know ahead of time how many lines of text there will be. We simply have to open the file and read the data in line by line until there's no more data to be read. As long as there's still text in the file, we keep on reading it. But this is exactly the purpose of event-controlled or while looping. The only new wrinkles now are that we need a few new Java capabilities. First, we need to turn the name of our file into a corresponding file type object. Then, we need to initialize a scanner object in a different way, using a file object instead of the typical standard input, or system.in. And finally, we need to make use of Scanner's ability to look ahead and see if there is still more data to be read, because we'll incorporate this into our looping continuation condition. As we see in this figure on the right, the Scanner class lets us set up alternate input pipelines from different data sources, and it's quite permissible to have multiple Scanner objects on hand for different input streams. So in this figure, we might have this first Scanner object called command input on hand to read input from the keyboard or command line, and a second scanner object called file input to read input from some specified text file. Both of these scanner objects can exist in our program at the same time. They are just initialized to take input data from different sources, as we see up here. There will be a more complete treatment of file I/O in the following course to this one. This is just an initial preview of this common while looping application. However, we may make use of text file input for a program later in the semester, so please pay close attention to the example we'll go through in a few moments. As mentioned a moment ago, here are the necessary new capabilities we need to perform reading from a file. First, here is an alternate constructor for instantiating a scanner object. Up to now, we've been using this first form, which uses system.in to associate a scanner object input stream with a command line. Now we introduce this alternate form, which instead takes a file object as its input and associates a scanner object with a specific file name, or more properly, a file object. Remember that this is called overloading in OO programming, or providing alternate forms for some method or constructor. So then how do we create the required file object? As we see here on the bottom, that's just as simple as using this file class constructor with a file name or the full path to our text file. The result of this file constructor is a file object, which in turn is used with this form of a scanner constructor. Finally, once we've got the file-based scanner object established, we need some way of checking whether there is still data to be read in the file. That's a job for the hasNext method of the scanner class, which is shown here. hasNext simply looks ahead to see if there is any additional data remaining in the file, and it returns a Boolean true or false status. We incorporate this method into our while loop's continuation condition. If it's true, there is still data in the file to be read, so we read the next line of the file. Otherwise, if the end of file, or EOF, has been reached, it returns a false and we stop looping. The end of file status becomes the event for our event-driven while looping when reading from a file. Let's next take a look at an example which demonstrates all these new capabilities. Here's a nice little example which pulls together everything we've just been talking about and demonstrates using a while loop and scanner to read from a text file. This example is a bit more involved, so I'm going to defer a lot of the details to the code walkthrough, which I encourage you to watch to see this code execute. However, let's note some key things about this file. In general terms, we are using two separate scanner objects in this code. We set up the first scanner as usual up here, and we use it to prompt for the name of the text file we want to read from. Then we use that file name here to instantiate a new file object, which we then turn around and use to set up a second scanner object to actually read from that file in this while loop. Notice a couple of new preliminaries in this code. First, we have to import these two new classes along with scanner, file and IOException. Then notice this required new addition at the end of the standard main method interface, this throws IOException. Without getting into too much detail about it, it turns out that when we use the file class, there is the possibility of an exception being thrown or generated, and that possibility demands to be acknowledged by this added throws fragment. If you don't include this, it will generate a compiler error. So when all is said and done, once we have the second scanner object associated with our prompted file name, we use the hasNext method as our loop continuation condition. As long as there is still text to be read, we make another iteration through the while loop to read the next line of text. Increment this lines counter, and for now simply echo the text we've read in. Once we reach the end of this file, this loop condition becomes false. We end the while loop and simply print out the final count of lines read in. Down here on the bottom, we see some sample output for a simple run-through. We prompt for the file name zzz.txt and echo that back out, then echo out each line as we read it, and finally the total number of lines read. Notice that here we are using our file-specific scanner object, but once we have it, we use it to read in an entire line as a string, just as we normally would. The nice thing about this code, of course, is that it's fully general and will work for any text file, be it 5 lines or 5,000 lines. To see this file executed and explained in more detail, please finish up by viewing the short code walkthrough for looping while file echo.java, which you'll find in the usual place. Open up this file in JGrasp so you can follow along. Be sure that what we're doing here makes sense, because we may need to use this example to read from a text file later in the semester on another program assignment. Okay, but for now, that's it for using a while loop and scanner to read from a file.